welcome back to the Topical Minds podcast. I am your host, Abdullah Kalafaro, and on this episode, we will be discussing all things artificial intelligence. My guest today is Amir Feizpour. Amir is the founder of Aggregate Intellect, an online platform for R&D teams and emerging technologies like AI to stay up to date and build products faster. Amir has built and grown a global community of thousands of AI practitioners gathered around topics in AI research, engineering, and product development. Prior to this, Amir was an NLP product lead at RBC, one of the largest banks in Canada, and held a postdoctoral position at University of Oxford conducting research on experimental quantum computing. So extremely happy to have you on, Amir. You've got quite the profile here, and I'm extremely intrigued to get into some of it.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and chat with you today. And hopefully we'll have some interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, so I wanted to, first of all, just get into what motivated you to get into the field that you ended up getting into. So what drove you to AI? And then, of course, what drove you to actually starting your own firm? Because you had a really good job at one of the largest organizations here in Canada, and then you decided to give that up to start your own. So what drove you to that?
Yeah. So what drove me to AI was really that I was a little tired of my academic career. I was, making very good progress, and I was working at one of the best universities. But, ultimately I felt like there was a lot of uncertainty about, getting a faculty job, doing too many postdocs, et cetera, that probably many of your audience are familiar with. So I was looking for an alternative, and, working in industry was a good option. So I actually first, since I was working in quantum computing, I first tried to build a quantum tech company. I had a patent that was interesting for me to build, some sort of a tech company out of it. But unfortunately, 5-6 years ago, the market for quantum computing was a lot smaller. So I was looking for an alternative, and of course, machine learning was becoming super hot and everybody was talking about it. And I was interested to, essentially poke my feet in it and see how it feels. And once I explored it a bit, it sounded like something that was quite interesting. And I was particularly very, very intrigued by natural language processing, because I never expected being able to, computationally analyze text and language. So I really wanted to explore that more. So I taught myself machine learning and natural language processing and such, and ended up coming back to Canada and working at Royal Bank as a data scientist initially, but then moved on to a senior management role, managing an engineering team, onboarding platforms and things like that, and interacted with many people across the enterprise through that role. But eventually I decided that I didn't even like that much, and I really wanted to build a product. So I started building a product using natural language processing, actually, to analyze compliance documents and things like that, regulatory documents for businesses like internal audit, capital market, etc. And that, was getting very good traction, and I was very happy with it, etc. And I had a really good team there that I hired myself. But, there was always that feeling of I need to own what I'm building, which is not possible to have at a corporate, really. And really, I knew that my personality is not so much of, work for others kind of person. So throughout the years that I was there, I was, slowly saving on the side as well, so that if I want to make a move like what I ended up making, I have enough backing. So eventually, at some point, I started a company. Well, actually, before that, I sort of started a community first. And the story behind that is that when I was moving from being a data scientist to a manager, I was very concerned about getting too far from the technical side. So I thought that after work, I can gather with a bunch of nerds like myself and talk about papers. And, that group of people that started with maybe 10, 15 people grew to 400 people in a few months, although we were only just inviting our friends. And that was sort of the core of the community that later turned into the company, and then et cetera, that we'll get into later. But I met my co-founder through that community, and we started talking about ideas, and I pitched to him this idea that I had, and we ended up starting the company. At the beginning, it was a super vague idea. Like, we didn't really know what we wanted to do. We just knew that we wanted to try it. So we started working. We tried many different ideas and experiments. We pivoted many times over the years since. But it's always very enjoyable to try out ideas and see what can solve a major problem that we're trying to solve.
So you have a pretty fascinating. So you were successful when you were at in the corporate world. You had created a product that was gaining a lot of traction, that had received good feedback, but you ultimately wanted to create something that you would be able to call your own. I wanted to, before we get into what aggregate intellect actually does, I wanted to unpack a few things that you said earlier. So natural language processing is something that you were extremely interested in. And then you also started to sort of learn more about machine learning. What is the difference between the two? And correct me if I'm wrong, but natural language processing, and you had mentioned this earlier, but it's essentially just getting machines capable to understand text and voice, and then basically be able to respond with text and voice as well, right? That's essentially what it is in a nutshell?
Yeah, largely. So I guess starting from the difference. So machine learning is a set of algorithms and processes, tools that we use to teach machines how to carry out tasks based on some observed data. So we essentially, instead of strictly programming the computer to do a certain task using heuristics, we would show it a bunch of examples and ask it to repeat that. So the majority of the machine learning models are designed to learn patterns in the data and replicate it as we ask them to carry out that task, which is quite interesting because it gives us the ability to, without explicitly programming a machine, to get it to do something we want, and that's absolutely fascinating. Of course, it comes with some caveats, but different story for a different day. But that has been, and that's the reason that it has been really taking over the industry, really rapidly over the past few years, because a lot of the systems that we have designed previously were rule-based, needed to be programmed very explicitly. But now we have this new thing where we can collect a lot of data and feed it into these algorithms, and they can do stuff for us much better than any heuristic would. Now, the majority of the data that we are talking about is usually structured, which means that they come in a table, like imagine Excel. There are like a bunch of columns, a bunch of values, a bunch of rows, etc., and then the algorithm analyzes this. So we are dealing with numbers, really, in most cases, which is kind of understandable to deal with it computationally. It gets a little more interesting when you add categorical information like gender, for example, like location, I mean like city, for example, country, etc. And now then people started thinking about more interesting things like image, for example. Like images are not structured like a table, but it is easy to map them into a matrix and then use that matrix to do computation on the image. But the thing that really fascinated me was natural language, because natural language is one of the best examples of what we call unstructured data, which means that ultimately it is data. There is a bunch of words and sentences, etc., either in the voice format or text format. The fact that we could grab that and turn it into rows of numbers was absolutely fascinating for me. So essentially what you do is that you grab text, you turn it into a bunch of vectors, and then do mathematical computations that machine learning needs on those vectors. And the majority of the innovation that is happening in natural language processing is to essentially map text, which is words, sentences, phrases, etc., into these vectors. So a lot of the interesting things that are happening is essentially that transition from unstructured data to vectors that then we can do computation on. Traditionally we had a lot of interesting ways to do that, like frequency based, etc. But in recent years, deep learning is really, really changing the game. So that's essentially it. Like, you grab text, turn it into vector, do computations. Now you can do a lot of interesting things. You can classify a piece of text, like if it is a tweet, is it a negative sentiment, is it a positive sentiment? If it is a long document in compliance in a company, can we find specific clauses related to specific topics in it very quickly, without knowing the exact phrases used in it, like just on the semantic level. And many other tasks, like can we get the computer to start from a prompt and generate text that is actually coherent and meaningful. And even like the latest things where these techniques have moved into formal language, like programming languages, where we can get machines to write code for us that actually runs. We actually did a video on it a few weeks ago. That's absolutely fascinating. It actually produces code that runs and builds websites and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting things happening in that space, and I hope some of your audience will get excited to check them out.
So coming back to when it comes to natural language programming, what is the relationship between NLP and like the sort of programming languages like R and Python? Like, does at NLP's foundation, are we using R and Python to initially get these machines to understand the text and voice? What's at the foundation of NLP? Like, what's used to actually get it done?
Yeah. So let's settle the Python versus R question. R is mostly to deal with statistical methods. So for the majority of maybe more traditional NLP stuff, where it was very frequency-based concepts, like you essentially look at the frequencies that words are repeated in a text to draw conclusions about that text, etc. Like, it's very limited, but what we could do back in the day. So R is capable of handling that a bit, but anything like deep learning and more advanced stuff that I talked about, those are all really in Python. The foundation, like regardless of the language, the foundation is really all about, how can I grab a bunch of text and turn it into vectors? That's literally all you're doing. And the advances that are happening is to do a better job at that. And better job means that things that are semantically more related will be vectors that are, closer to each other in some vector space. So the core foundation of the majority of different types of packages that we deal with is really from that. Now, you can do a lot of different tasks. So really the differences of, different packages that we use in NLP come from, what kind of task are you trying to do after you have the vectors? Like, are you trying to extract named entity from a document? Like, identifying that this phrase is the name of a person, and this person, for example, is the president of the United States or something, right? And many other tasks. So, it really depends on your application and what you're trying to do and use case. But there are many, many different packages that we typically use. It's, there are so many open source tools that it's very unlikely to write things from scratch. And the majority of them are really in Python.
And the vectors, are they all like standardized? Do they all follow a same sort of format? So then, when you talk about open source and perhaps developers creating tools that then take those vectors to then, make sense of them, are all of the vectors from an output standpoint, are they all standardized?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about natural language is that it is something that is commonly used. Like it's a I like to say it is a it's a shared imagination, right? So it is not like, for example, transaction data. Like transaction data is unique to a particular company and the products they have, et cetera, right? So if you train a model on transaction data, it's unlikely to be able to use it elsewhere, or it is harder. But natural language is just a shared tool, right? So in principle, if we get vectors that represent, the word artificial or the word intelligence or any other phrases like artificial intelligence, then these mean the same thing regardless of the context in most cases. Like there's definitely nuances, like some words Apple might mean different in the context of grocery versus tech. But the majority of like 90% of the words and phrases are pretty much the same. So what has happened is that we just used pre-trained vectors in a lot of cases. And, we all use the same thing that is trained and then use it to slightly fine-tune to the particular domain and, take it from there. So we always start from the same standard. We call them embeddings. And then build on top of those and, slightly modify them for different use cases.
One of the things you mentioned earlier, and I'm curious to know, what the applications, could eventually turn into. But you had mentioned, being able to gauge positive and negative emotions, and that's sentiment analysis, right? That's what that's called.
That's right.
So within sentiment analysis, let's assume you've got this legal document, and you're trying to understand, whether or not the party that's drafted this legal agreement, what type of emotions they are spewing through this document. Are you able to go through it and say, over here, this is something that's perhaps negative for us, this is perhaps positive for us? Are you able to gauge that through sentiment analysis?
Yes. Well, I'll generalize your question a bit and answer that. So sentiment analysis is a fairly narrow example of text classification in general. So, tagging text as positive or negative emotion or sentiment is, one type of classification. There could be many other ways to classify text. For example, you might be trying to, see if, based on the reports about a certain company, you want to see how risky they are. You want to say, classify them. Is this a risky company financially or not, right? If you're investing in that company, for example. Or in the legal space, you might want to classify, paragraphs in a text as, is this useful for something or not, right? There are many types of classification that you can do. But for the particular example you gave, you could definitely do that. And you can even go more granular. You can talk about things like, for example, let's talk about social media about companies, right? So people tweet about companies about how they feel about a company. And you can analyze that and say, people are angry at Apple today, right? Because you can analyze their tweets and, classify that, okay, they are angry today. The next day you can analyze it and see that they are very happy with it. The other day you can analyze and be like, okay, they're pretty neutral, or any other shade of emotion that you're really interested. One of the very interesting use cases that I actually have seen is doing that to track mental health problems. You can, for example, look at what people write on Reddit in particular subreddits and see if there's a trend of behavior that is correlated with certain mental problems like depression or problems that youth deal with. So there are lots of very interesting things that you can do, and really depends on the use case and domain that your text is in.
Yeah. So it's fascinating stuff, and I wanted to ask you this a little bit later, but I think it would make sense for me to ask it now. You had previously worked in banking, right? And of course, there's quite a few the systems and platforms that are currently being used in banking, whether they're client-facing or not. They are using AI. They're increasingly using AI, whether it's through chatbots, whether it's through whatever that sort of platform or system is. But what do you see will be increasing applications of AI in banking? And do you think that banking is really a place where perhaps the application and use of AI is in its nascent stages? They really haven't, taken advantage of the full capabilities of AI, and there's a lot that still needs to be unlocked.
Yeah, I mean, for the very interesting thing about banking in general is that uh, it's a system that has been generating a lot of data over the years, especially parts of the business that are more data driven, like capital markets, for example, like very very data driven, very model driven. They've been collecting a lot of interesting data for a very very long time. So the opportunity to use machine learning to optimize processes related to internal operations or external facing interactions with consumers or partners or whatever else is enormous. Like there are a very large range of very wide range of applications that you can imagine. Definitely, banking system south of the border is way ahead, and when you look at their use cases and the way they're using AI, it's absolutely fascinating. Like the type of things they're doing is really interesting. But in Canada also we have had a lot of progress. Royal Bank definitely making huge strides in certain areas. Like you definitely have heard of Borealis, like the research arm of RBC that is focused on applications of AI. One of the very fascinating things, for example, they did recently is that when you want to query a database, usually you use the so-called SQL language. Like you have to write code to get the database to tell you some information about the users. For example, if you want to ask how many consumers do we have in this particular geographical location, you write a bunch of code and it gives it to you. And one fascinating thing they did is that they created the system that translates literally the question that I asked into that SQL query, that then the database spits out the right answer. So I can literally ask natural language questions from the database without knowing how to code. And of course, that's more of a proof of concept at this point, I suppose. But the fact that they are thinking about problems like that, like how can we make it easier for, I don't know, consumers come to our website and ask a question about something, without knowing how to code our database, or even the internal analysts when they are analyzing the markets, etc. Without knowing to code, they can just literally talk to the computer and get meaningful answers. That's absolutely fascinating. But that's a very very specific example. Since we were talking about NLP, I'm bringing that up. But there are applications everywhere. Like there's so much optimization that can be done in operations, internal operations, for example. And a lot of the teams that I interacted with, were busy doing that. There are so many important applications to deal with risk because, obviously, having to deal with finances of people and finances in the market, it's very important to be risk aware and be careful about how certain actions are taken. So creating models that assess risk of the markets, of transactions, of interactions is very important. The most, I guess, everyday example of it is credit risk scoring, which is how much credit is reasonable to give you without the danger of losing money. And many other examples. Like there could be examples on the financial instruments they use. It could be examples on operations. It could be examples with the website where people interact with the system, and many more. So the opportunity is huge, and banks are definitely making a lot of progress. If you ask me, they can be a lot more efficient, but they're doing what they can within their constraints.
Yeah, because we see quite a few interesting applications and tools coming out that have that, machine learning aspect to it. So, for example, the client inputs information, and then they take that information to draw certain conclusions, and then you basically use that to continue the conversation and improve the client experience. So to me, like the field of AI is fascinating because the applications are so vast and far reaching. So I'm curious. So you decided initially to create this community for yourself. You started off with a dozen or so people that quickly grew to 400, and you decided to start what is now known as aggregate intellect, and you have thousands of people on your community. What exactly would you say aggregate intellect does? And would you say that your organization sort of has a unique place in the AI world, either because of the way you are connecting different people, or perhaps you have the latest resources that you are providing people with a view to? What is your vision for aggregate intellect, and what has been accomplished so far?
It's funny that you asked that question. Yesterday, I was talking to a person that I met for the first time, and they were telling me that they really liked what they saw on the website. And I asked them, what was your impression of it and what did you like about it? And their response was that they feel that we are taking a very pragmatic approach to handling and distributing knowledge to people rather than just focusing on theoretical stuff. We are really activating people to learn and then use their knowledge to carry out tasks, which is really the foundation of how the idea of aggregate intellect came about. So initially, I was very bothered that, having seen both sides, like the research side and the industry side, I was very bothered that it was so difficult to translate research into industrial products. So I was looking for a solution to that problem. So therefore, we are taking a very, very pragmatic, stance about how that should be done. So, to answer your, first question about what aggregate intellect is, what we're building is really what we call a smart knowledge management system. So the problem that we're trying to solve is that when you're doing R&D projects, research and development projects, a lot of the time in at least the R&D phase, the majority of what you're doing is starting from some initial assumptions about the knowledge that is necessary to solve that problem. And all you're doing during the R&D project is really evolving that knowledge into something that is then, productizable or commercializable, etc. Right? So you start from some assumptions about your problem and generate or collect some knowledge, and then evolve that knowledge to something that is actually scalable, commercializable, etc., which becomes your product, which becomes your engineered product. But there are no good solutions really for knowledge management, given the very experimental nature of that phase. Like most people use note-taking applications like Google Doc, Notion, Confluence, and such to manage the knowledge, but it has the big problem that it is very, in some way, unstructured, but in some ways limiting, because you just write notes essentially. So updating that notes in settings where everything is very experimental is very difficult. So that knowledge doesn't really evolve as effectively as it should. And when I talk about knowledge, I'm talking about what papers are important for my work, which pieces of these papers, what source code, what GitHub repository should I look at, what data sets should I look at. And these days, it's very common, like what you're doing, what are the YouTube videos that I should look at, et cetera, right? So that knowledge is usually held in people's minds and sometimes written in notes, buried in paragraphs in Confluence. But it's not really effective to activate people's ability to carry out tasks and do use cases. So we have come up with this sort of documentation, if you like, that is modular, collaborative, and smart. Modular in the sense that pieces of knowledge are, created in small modules that can be, added or removed with a few clicks. And it is collaborative because, very much like we're getting a lot of inspirations from GitHub, how it is built. So a lot of the functionalities that we are developing are inspired from GitHub. So we are trying to do what GitHub did for source code development for knowledge. So a lot of the collaborative features pretty much mirror what you can do with source code on GitHub. And the smart piece is, once the knowledge that you're capturing is modular and structured, then you can treat it as data and use it to automatically keep an eye on what else exists on the internet that is relevant to this product feature or this use case that I'm working on. And that's absolutely fascinating because you can do a lot of interesting things. Like our system, hopefully one day, like we're working towards it, will be able to monitor your use case. Like, what is the objective of your use case? What is it that you have done so far? Like, what papers have you looked at? What is on your Jira backlog, your project management backlog? And use all of this information to remind you every day that, by the way, there's also this paper that you should look at. This video just popped up on YouTube that is very relevant to your use case. This repository was just released that you should take a look because it is relevant to your use case. It's sort of a knowledge assistant, if you like, that helps you keep up to date, manage your knowledge, and really ultimately reduce the risk of that very, very experimental phase of your product development.
So that's fascinating. So basically what you're doing is you've created this community where so first of all, before you even do that, you're scraping a bunch of information from the internet, right? Like if new papers come out, if new videos come out, if there's anything that comes out, you are basically referencing that and providing your members the ability to sort of interact with it and engage with it. But like talk me through this. So let's assume I'm a data scientist, okay, and like I'm working at a bank and I'm like, hey, I'm working on this really cool tool, but I need help with X, Y, and Z. So I can go on your website and I can perhaps maybe search that in. And then for that particular topic, I would get a bunch of resources, whatever the latest is out on that, be it papers, be it perhaps, videos that came out. And I'm benefiting from this peer-to-peer learning platform. Is that fair to say that you've created this peer-to-peer learning platform where people can go in and say, hey, I've got, can you help me with this? Or I'm trying to do this. And then you can basically get all of the different resources from your website.
Yes and no. So I guess to take a step back, what we are trying to do using the platform eventually is to automate the decision-making process when you are essentially curating the knowledge that is necessary for you to do your use case. And knowledge curation is finding resources and figuring out how to use them. And that's a very, very expert level, skill set and ability. And we want to automate that. But that's obviously very, very difficult. So where we have started is exactly where the community comes in, because relying on machine intelligence alone is not going to be very plausible. So what we're building is really a combination of machine intelligence and human intelligence, or rather crowd intelligence, if you like. So in shorter term, the way our platform is being used is that people, when they're collaborating on projects, and projects can be more theoretical, like I want to learn about graph neural networks, etc., all the way to very practical things like I want to detect forest fires using drones, and these are real examples that exist on our platform. As people are collaborating on these projects, they would document the resources that they used and evolve that as they go through the project. Like they start from the initial resources, then they find more resources or figure out that some of the resources are not helpful, etc., and they annotate these, right? For example, this video was good from minute 10 to 15 because it talks about blah, blah, blah. Or this GitHub repository is helpful, but use it with, this package, etc., right? So they write annotations like that as well, so that once another person has the same need, they can come back to the same recipe and replicate it. It is very reproducible, essentially. So that's the current use of it. Like it's more of a community-driven application. It's more of a use case, if you like. We even use it to work with earlier stage startups because we crowdsource solutions to R&D projects for them, and a few other applications. But the long-term vision is for this to be really a SaaS product that teams use internally when they're collaborating on projects. So say, you are a team of 5, 10 people, data scientists, machine learning engineers, software engineers, working on a use case. The vision for our platform is that it integrates into the project management, to communication, to development, experimentation tools that you use in your R&D, and brings in a lot of information. And not only you can interface with everything that is publicly available through the community, you can interface with the internal systems. And then hopefully once the smart part is working well, then it can, in a very smart way, help you as you go through your project. So not only you see the manual curation that others have done, if it is relevant to your use case, but you can get personalization and adaptation, customization to your use case that you're doing right now. So the long-term vision is really for enterprise teams to use this tool the way they use Slack, the way they use GitHub. And GitHub is actually a very good example because it can be used to collaborate internally with your own people, or you can use it to collaborate externally because you pull in from open source, modify it, use it, and sometimes contribute back. And that's exactly the mode of operation we're imagining our platform will have eventually.
So basically, there's a lot of potential to grow. There's a lot of potential for you to have multiple different types of organizations and individuals tap into your resource and really benefit from what you have, especially once you have that smart view come in to play, where you can really have those personalized insights and really help you drive your what it is that you're looking to accomplish, I think, a lot more quickly, just because you have those personalized insights. How has the journey been? I would imagine you've seen some pretty crazy growth already. And when did you get started?
So we incorporated the company in 2019, but it was a side hustle for us until early 2020, ironically, right before the pandemic lockdown started. We quit our jobs, and then everybody was like, oh, by the way, they're closing all the offices. So really full-time, it's been just over a year, maybe about 18 months. It's interesting that you earlier mentioned that our platform is a learning platform. We initially actually launched as an educational platform. Our hypothesis at the time was that we can educate people to leverage research in their product development better. That's why we were very focused on advanced research, machine learning engineering, and machine learning product development. But at some point, we used to run workshops, and people would come in and learn things and build simple products collaboratively. And the interesting thing that started happening was that companies, founders actually would come to us and be like, I really like this project that is done on your platform. Can I purchase this and use it in my company? And we got approached from 3 different cases. And in one case, we sold that project for $20,000 and just to split the money with the team. And therefore, that really triggered a pivot in a company towards, away from education and more towards product development. And that's when we started working more with the startups, asking them proactively, what AI-based product feature are you interested in? And, can we help you crowdsource it? People in our community, it's a really global community. We have people from all over the place. They're really thirsty for very interesting projects. A lot of them have day jobs, but in their evenings and weekends, they're looking for something cool to do. And earlier stage startups don't have a lot of resources. So of course, it's a very good match to help these early stage founders with the product features they need, and people in our community with interesting projects to do. So we've been seeing a lot of growth on that side, working with more and more companies, even hopefully some government sectors will have some interesting projects on our platform soon. And but at the same time, we've been developing our product that I mentioned earlier for the smart knowledge management. And that has been making a very, very good progress. And actually, we launched the latest version of it about a month ago, and over the past 30 days, we saw about 100% increase in our website traffic. So there's definitely something, and we're trying to leverage that and get it into as many people as we can, because ultimately our goal is to help people really build products faster using AI by reducing the risk of bad choices.
Yeah, I think you're playing in a field that's going to continue to grow. I think you've gotten at the right time. Like it would be hard to argue that the the hype around AI will continue to increase. The applications will continue to increase, but I think the pivot to becoming a middleman or becoming an intermediary for individuals who are looking for these solutions and then providing extremely talented individuals who are able to provide these solutions, connecting these two different groups. I think that's genius. But I'm just wondering now, in this particular space, do you have a lot of competition? Because I know you can go on certain websites and look for data scientists, look for individuals who have certain skill sets. So are you finding that that's a competitive space to be in?
So I guess one thing that I need to clarify is that we are not in the talent space. So our value proposition is not really, here are a bunch of people you can hire, but it is more like a crowdsourcing. Like, as I mentioned, like a lot of these people have day jobs, right? Like they're working somewhere, but they have some extra bandwidth. Like if you have read Exponential Organizations, building a really fast growing organization is all about repurposing extra bandwidths of individuals. Like examples of that is Uber, right? Or Airbnb, like where you rent out a spare room in your house or a spare seat in your car, etc. So we are going with the same philosophy. Like a lot of people that we are dealing with in our community are intermediate to advanced level practitioners. Like they have day jobs, but they're interested in side projects that are interesting. Because let's say I'm working in financial industry, but I'm very curious about healthcare. So, instead of jumping in, leaving my job and going to healthcare, I might want to do a few projects in healthcare to just see how it feels. Or maybe my expertise is natural language processing, but I'm very curious about computer vision. So I want to do a few projects there. So that's mostly sort of the itch that they're scratching, if you like. From a community point of view, we as a principle, we stay away from talent space because, as you said, it's a very, very crowded space. So we don't take a stance on that at all. So our focus is how can we use our product really to enable these individuals to do their R&D projects much faster, because ultimately that's what our goal is. So our really what we're bringing to the table is obviously access to this expert network, but also utilizing our platform for coordination, collaboration, and delivering those projects much faster. Because otherwise, it's not going to be a very scalable solution.
Yeah, and it seems as though your aggregate intellect has turned into some sort of a full like turnkey solution organization where you because of the nature of all the different solutions and services that you are providing, I think ultimately it'll just be a place where organizations will go to for anything that's AI related, machine learning related, NPL related. I think that'll be AI aggregate intellect will probably be the go-to source. So I'm excited to see where your organization sort of ends up going and the heights that it's able to reach. I wanted to switch gears and go to something really basic, which is, what to you is AI, and what interesting or exciting trends do you see in the field of AI in the near term and perhaps even down the road?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned earlier, AI is really at the moment mostly machine learning, which is teaching machines to do tasks based on data. Now, where is this going? There are definitely a lot of different industry applications, but the one that I'm mostly excited, well, outside of NLP, the one that I'm mostly excited about is the increased use of machine learning in sciences. So being a physicist, I'm very excited to see that there are a lot of applications of machine learning in physics, in biology, in chemistry. Actually, one of the most major biology questions, which is, how do proteins fold, which is, a very long-standing problem that we had no idea how to solve for the longest time, had a relatively decent solution very recently using machine learning. So seeing things like that, the fact that, machine learning comes in and provides a solution to problems that are even computationally prohibitive, is quite interesting, because that's the capability of machine learning algorithms today, that they're very good at leveraging and finding patterns in the data, and they're very efficient at it. So the fact that we can use that to do much more efficient approaches to solve scientific questions is absolutely fascinating. Like Large Hadron Collider, like one of the arguably the largest experiment that humanity has been running, is using machine learning very, very extensively to analyze their data. So I'm very excited to see what happens in that space. Drug discovery is a whole thing that is heavily leveraging machine learning, which is absolutely fascinating. Given all the above, there's an area that I'm particularly interested in, because that's being used a lot, which is graph neural networks, which is the ability of you to analyze data that is in a graph structure, in a network structure, like a bunch of nodes, concepts, for example, you can imagine, and their relationships. And that's been extensively used in a lot of science-related applications. So I'm very excited to see more development in that field, in that technical field as well going forward. And that's, one of the most, after natural language processing, graphs are actually one of the most favorite topics on our platform that people like to engage in. And that's definitely the same in industry as well.
So what are some of those applications using graph neural networks? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can probably give a few examples. Like going back to the banking, and maybe all industries really. So cyber attacks is a big thing these days, right? So, and analyzing cyber attacks and, identifying them and preventing them is a very, very important task. But, as our detection systems are getting better, the attacks are getting more convoluted and complicated as well. So normally they involve many, many entities that work in coordination to carry out an attack, to be successful. And it is very difficult to use the typical, approaches that are more linear, one step further kind of approaches to analyze and detect those. So that's exactly where something like a graph analysis would come in, because you can identify a bunch of different actors and vectors and actors and entities and login times and et cetera, and how all of these relate to each other to be able to analyze, is this an attack or not? Or is this a malicious behavior or not? So that's one example. They're extensively used in chemistry because, you can model molecules and things like that as graphs and then do analysis on them, which, is really the basis for things like drug discovery, material discovery in general. All the way to things like recently DeepMind had this news about how they used graph neural networks to analyze traffic and reduce the estimated time on Google Maps significantly. Again, same argument, like there are entities which are places of interest and the way they are connected to each other, which are streets. So it just makes a lot of sense to use graph to analyze something like that. I'm not exactly sure that's exactly what they did, but you can imagine that graph is the right solution there. And I'm sure there are many others. Potential applications like in physics, for example, predicting weather is a very difficult problem. And graphs have applications in simulating fluid dynamics, like essentially how air and vapor and things like that moves. I actually saw something about that in the news this morning, but I haven't read it yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're using graph neural networks there as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So while you were, mentioning some of these examples, I was thinking that really any sort of system in which you have multiple different things that are connected to one another, and you have that cause and effect, perhaps, relationship that you could essentially bring this into. So even, for example, in manufacturing, where you've got perhaps like large scale production facilities, like using that to make sure that you perhaps prevent stoppages or prevent breakdowns. Yeah, it's fascinating. AI is such, and when it comes to some of these, whether it's graph neural networks or whether it's natural language processing, I feel like there's so much opportunity and there's so much potential where really I feel as though organizations should be devoting so much more time and resources to getting themselves just up to par with what's actually happening in AI. I think that, and would you say that perhaps most organizations are lagging behind, like where the market is in terms of like what all AI has to offer? Would you say that that's the case?
I would like to point out something about what you said before we go there.
Yeah.
So definitely graphs have applications in supply chain kind of problems for sure. Manufacturing being part of that. One thing that you said is a very interesting small nuance that I would like to correct. So machine learning in general is very bad at handling causal relationships. So it's never about cause and effect. It's more about correlations. Like this is more likely to happen with that kind of scenarios. Like it takes a whole different conversation to talk about how causal relationships can be included in machine learning to enable it to solve much more interesting problems. I'm reading currently a book called Why that talks about that exact problem, and I highly recommend it. But definitely machine learning is not capable of mapping out causal relationships. But we can do so much with correlation alone. Like it doesn't need to be this is the cause of that, but rather this is related to that because it happened at the same time or it happened at the same location, etc., etc. You get the idea. About organizations, I guess that question is a little underdefined. So the answer to that question is always relative. So depending on the type of organization, the maturity of, how long they have been using AI, what kind of use cases they've done, who their leaders are. It really depends on all the above. Compared to places like the United States, like China, even, I lived in England for a while, even compared to London, Canadian industry use of AI is definitely lagging. It is, somebody was estimating at least a few years compared to those markets. And I tend to believe that, although it's hard to argue to be accurate, but definitely a few years lagging, making very good strides in making better progress, and with a lot of research labs also moving to Toronto and Montreal, there's definitely a lot of opportunity to go forward. But it's not a trivial thing to adopt AI in organizations. As much as it sounds like a super urgent and necessary thing, which it is, it's very complicated to integrate something that is as fuzzy as AI, either in the stage of building or in the stage of using. Like it requires sometimes significant system change, like significant business workflow change, or significant changes into technical systems, like architecture of systems you're using, significant changes in even how we expect things to happen, right? Because there is a bit of a statistical nature to it now, like everything is not super certain. So there is a lot of change and growing and adaptation that needs to happen for the industry to really, leverage AI effectively. Over the past, 5 years that I worked in AI in Canada, I've seen a lot of progress. Like I do see, a lot of teams and companies are a lot more mature in the way they think about it. But is there room? 100%. Like we just have begun, and there's a long road ahead.
Are there any examples that come to you of AI having gone wrong? Perhaps when, if we think about like certain military applications, we say, okay, well, this clearly was not what was meant to happen. And, this caused a lot of damage and there was a lot of, lives lost or whatever it is. But like, that's more from a military standpoint. But like, aside from that, like, are there any examples that come to you where like this organization, wanted to bring AI in, and really what ended up happening was, a big disaster or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question and probably a whole topic to talk about separately. Where, I guess where you're going is really about ethical side of AI. Like, is this a fair use of AI? And that question always existed in industry. Like, if you're using a technology, is it fair to let it make decisions? But now it is a much more important question because we are letting AI to make much more important decisions, right? For example, does this person get a mortgage? Or is this person able to unlock their phone? There are a lot of things like that are either minor but everyday inconveniences, all the way to significant things like medical decisions, like does this person get a mortgage, to military applications, as you said, like are a bunch of citizens going to be bombed here? So definitely there is a lot of danger in all the above. I'm happy that there's a conversation going on about it. There were a bunch of scandals around how Facebook was using data and the private information of people. There were a lot of examples where your skin tone was preventing facial recognition systems from identifying your face and allowing you to do whatever the system was trying to do. Just simply because the system hadn't seen a person with a dark skin, for example. So there are a lot of questions like that on a data level, on a design level, and then on the application level that has to be asked and answered. That's definitely a very, very extended topic to talk about, and I think you should bring some people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I am to talk about that, but that's definitely a very, very important topic.
Yeah, even when we just think about like Tesla, and I know one of the things that sort of kept them back is every now and then, when we think about the incidents that happened with their cars and the whole self-driving aspect of it, of course that that is using AI, right? Because you're essentially like taking all this different information in, and decisions on turning and stopping and all of those are being made based on the data that's being fed into the system, to the machine, right? So I would imagine that that's probably machine learning happening, or perhaps that's the application of machine learning. Would that be fair to say?
It is. I mean, that's actually a very interesting example for the following reason for me. Self-driving cars, I just, as a disclaimer, I don't know a ton about self-driving cars and how they work, but definitely, a lot of vision-related application, a lot of signal processing application from various types of sensors, et cetera, that feed into some intelligent algorithms, either you want to call them machine learning or not, that then make decisions about the steering and speed and et cetera, right? So the interesting problem that happens there is really the agency of. So there are really two questions. Like, one is, do self-driving cars reduce the chances of accidents? And I think we have good theoretical foundations and experimental data at this point to believe that it is probably true. If you imagine a future where most cars are self-driving, they can communicate with each other and reduce the chances of crash. they can reduce the chances of traffic jams, etc., etc. So the argument for having self-driving cars, I think, is relatively clear. So the question that is really left to ask is the agency aspect of it. Like, for example, if you get into a crash, because it will happen, like it's not 100%, if you get into an accident, was there the person in the car an agent that caused that accident, which has a lot of interesting implications about insurance. If two self-driving cars crash, what does that mean? Because now we can assign agency. We can say you were behind the steering wheel and you hit this other car, therefore you're at fault. Talking about that from an insurance point of view is relatively straightforward. Now, if you're allowing machines to make those decisions, who's going to be at fault? Like, whose fault is it that these two crashed? Is it the person? Is it the company? Is it the sensor, the manufacturer of the sensors, etc., etc., right? So that's a very interesting question to talk about, which, is a good segue to talk about what I was saying earlier. Using AI effectively in industry requires a lot of rewiring how we think about stuff in terms of business workflows, in terms of everyday workflows of actual operations, and many more. So it's very interesting to see how this evolves into the future that is really inevitable, where AI will be used everywhere, and how we come up with new operations and new systems that incorporate that.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think what you're saying makes total sense, and I'm curious to see like where we head as well, because you're right. Like, what happens in a situation where we've got a self-driving car gets into an accident? Who's to blame? And what are the legal implications for that? Like, what sort of recourse does somebody have to that, the individual in the car? Like, it's interesting to see like how some of these things will continue to play out for individuals who are looking to get into, who are aspiring, perhaps data scientists who are looking to get into this field. I know one of the things you had mentioned earlier, was when you were speaking about individuals who have extra bandwidth and who use that time to do projects that they are interested in or work in areas that they have that they are passionate about. What are certain things that you would recommend for aspiring data scientists to focus on? Perhaps be it certain programming languages and have that like foundation. Maybe it's the type of experience that they want to develop, work on certain projects. Like, what would you recommend or propose?
Yeah, so I guess I'll do a quick plug and we'll come back to that later. But I actually do, sort of almost daily free career coaching sessions. So I'll send you the link, and you can definitely add it to the show notes for people to book me and talk about this more on a one-on-one basis. But the general advice that I usually give is that beyond learning some of the basics, which is, can you code in Python? Can you code in PyTorch, for example, if you want to do a little more advanced stuff? Do you know the basics of machine learning? Have you taken a couple of courses? Beyond these, I wouldn't really take more courses or things like that, certificates, etc. Those are not particularly helpful. My recommendation and point of view and a bit of a stance is that the only thing that is really helpful to you, the only thing that really helped me was doing projects. So beyond some foundational level, all you need to do is as many projects as you can on various topics that you're interested in. Obviously, you can take two different routes. If you want to get deeper in a particular topic, it could be application or technical area, you want to do more projects in those. Or if you want to be a more generalist, you still don't know where you want to go deeper, you should try to do projects in different areas. As I mentioned earlier, again, like this is a bit of a plug, but in our community, we have discussion groups which do exactly that. Like, they gather weekly, they either read papers or do projects together or any variations of that idea. Essentially a think tank, if you like, where you can hang out with your peers and talk about interesting things, do interesting projects. Like, we have people who are using machine learning on blockchain for credit scoring right now, or people who are working on fake news detection or detection of fires in forests, all the way to like very theoretical topics like research in NLP, etc. So being involved in communities like that is a very good way to get exposure, because you hear a lot of key phrases that you don't know. You go look them up, or you ask from a peer or an expert, or you get your hands dirty with a project. As I said, like we sometimes bring in projects from companies, so we can work on a real world problem with real data sets with an actual company, etc. But that's not the only way to do it. There are many other ways. There's Kaggle. We can pick up projects to do from there. I'm sure if you search machine learning projects on the internet, you get many options. But ultimately, I think putting my hiring manager hat on, that's really what I look for. Like, everybody knows Python, everybody knows basics of machine learning, etc., etc. I just want to see how many projects you've done and what those projects are. What did you achieve in them? So as long as you can do projects and talk about them in an interesting way, I think there's a good chance that we can get inside. One last piece that I would say is that a lot of people who book me to talk start by saying, I want to be a data scientist. I don't think that's the right approach. Data scientist is one of the roles. There are many other related roles like machine learning engineering, data engineers, etc., etc., etc. So product management. So you have to think about how to leverage your strength and your experience to find the best role that you can start interacting with machine learning. So thinking about that more deeply to understand, what are you good at, and what is the closest and lowest barrier of entry into using machine learning in your career going forward is a very, very important thing that a lot of people don't take enough time to think about, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for anybody looking to get into and be successful and making sure that they stand out. I think having that project experience, like you're saying, is key. How do you set yourself apart from others who have the exact same skills? It's your work experience. It's what you've been involved in. How does one become a member at Aggregate Intellect? Is it do you have different memberships? Does one what's the sign up process like?
Yeah. So again, happy to send you the link to include it in your show notes. But you can go to ai.science. Very simple to remember. And create an account there. There you can interact with everything. For individuals, the platform is free to use, so you can use all the content and everything that is on there for free without any payments. Later, we will have paid plans for teams and enterprises, etc. But if you're an individual using the platform to reskill, upskill, keep up to date, etc., that's always going to be free for you. There is also our Slack workspace where our community lives and all of the interactions happen there at the moment. Later, it will be integrated into the website, but right now it is a Slack workspace. Again, I will send you the link and definitely include it in the show notes.
Awesome. Is there anything that you would like to promote or maybe plug about what it is that your organization is currently working on? I think we spoke about some pretty cool stuff, some pretty interesting stuff that I'm sure people will find interesting listening to. But is there anything that perhaps we didn't cover that you would like to talk about?
I would say, of course, what we are doing is a work in progress. So there are updates coming out every week. If the best way really to stay in touch with us is to join our Slack channel, because there we're posting all the new content that we're generating. We're actually in the process of open sourcing a lot of the content that was premium, and now it is available open source for people to use. And all the product features that I mentioned previously, all the projects that are coming to the community, all of these are communicated through Slack. So I think that's a very good place to join and keep an eye on everything that is going on, as well as the discussion groups that I mentioned. So I would just encourage you to, and it is free, so there is really very little downside to joining our community. And really, like any other community, you'll get as much out of it as you put in. So come in, interact with people, contribute, and hopefully it will help you like it has helped many, many other people, take leaps in their careers towards being better, machine learning practitioners, or even finding their first job, and all that. So hope to see you all in our community.
Awesome. Yeah, I think just taking a look at your website and your platform and just seeing the growth that you've experienced in your users, clearly you've got a lot of like-minded individuals, and it'll only continue to increase. And the amount of learning and resources that you can benefit from, I think it's hard to argue against being a part of that, especially if you are interested, if you're currently either a data scientist and or working in a role where you are dealing with new technologies, emerging technologies, and you've got that NLP component or you've got that machine learning component. Like, make sure that you take advantage of like the platform. Amir, it was a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure I would love to have you on, in the future to see like what all amazing things you guys have accomplished. I'm sure you'll continue to do some really good work. It would be difficult to put money against the field that you're in and the work that you're doing. I think it's just, there's a lot of really good information that people can benefit from. So thank you for being on. For everybody that tuned in, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. We're available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. So really, any way that you want to interact with us, you're able to. Make sure that you leave a review, that you comment. If you feel passionate about something, we're happy to hear from you. And I will see you on the next show. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.